Dr. Husam Abu Safiya, the director of Kamal Edwan Hospital in the northern part of Gaza. The Israeli occupation forces, in one of their attacks against the hospital, fired on and killed Dr. Abu Safiya's son. Dr. Abu Safiya endured a shrapnel wound to the leg that tore through his muscle. Dr. Abu Safiya watched his hospital, his place of work, a place of healing, be bombed and targeted on a daily basis, be subject to siege, prevented from even having food and water. And Dr. Abu Safiya remained steadfast and said that he wasn't going to leave his patients, nor was he going to allow them to be expelled from the hospital. Reports have confirmed that he was abducted by the Israeli occupation forces on December 27th. He was physically assaulted by those soldiers, subjected to severe beatings, including being whipped with a thick wire commonly used for street electrical wiring, before being transferred to the Sidi Taiman military camp, also known as the concentration camp, the torture camp. We also call on the world to recognize that if Kamal Edwan Hospital is decommissioned, there will be no way of preserving conditions of life for the remaining 75,000 civilians in North Gaza. We need so much more advocacy and action in this moment. Hello and welcome to Palestine Pod, the mostly weekly podcast where we break down the latest headlines dealing with Palestine from all over the world and bring you stories, commentary, and interviews with the aim of supporting the Palestinian struggle for decolonization, justice, and equal rights. I'm one of your hosts, Lara E. You might know me from Instagram as @GazanGirl, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mikey B.
What's up, y'all? Mikey B on TikTok, Michael Schertzer on Instagram, and you could call me Mikey Intifada if you're having to spend an extra $150 million just because of little old us.
Before we get into today's episode, please like, comment, subscribe if you hang out with us on YouTube. If you're listening on a podcast app, subscribe and leave a review. As always, you can find our full episodes and sources on PalestinePod.com. And if you want to get involved in the conversation, reach out to us at PalestinePod@gmail.com and give us a follow on Instagram at the Palestine Pod. You can also find us on Patreon, where you get early access to the Palestine Pod episodes, an additional podcast per week, which is a little more laid back. We talk politics, Palestine, pop culture, and get a little more personal. And we're also hosting our monthly Zoom happy hours with our Patreon subscribers only. So check us out on patreon.com/PalestinePod. I want to start this episode by talking about Dr. Husam Abu Safiya, who is the director of Kamal Edwan Hospital in the northern part of Gaza. He's a pediatrician. He's a father. He's a husband. He has children. And I first got to know him several months ago because I would see his appeals to the international community filmed from the inside of Kamal Edwan Hospital, explaining the conditions that patients and hospital staff were undergoing as a result of direct Israeli attacks on the hospital and the Israeli siege, in particular on the northern part of Gaza, which has prevented the entry of food and water and essential medicine needed to treat people who are injured during a genocide. And I waited every day for his updates and would watch with earnest all of the videos that he would film and the information that he would provide, and paid particular attention to his tone and his style and his framing, and was so impressed with this individual. I know that his family holds citizenship of Kazakhstan, and so he probably traveled and lived outside of Gaza before returning back to Gaza to serve his people as a pediatrician, as a physician, as a director of a hospital. But his message was very clear across all the videos that he filmed. He was appealing to the international community for assistance, to require Israel to stop its attacks against Kamal Edwan Hospital, but also against the Gazan healthcare system more broadly, and to allow patients to be treated in a humane way, and to allow physicians to be able to do their job, which is to treat people who are suffering. And I started to as every day would go on and he would film another video, he would film another video, he would film another video, you start to feel like, okay, surely the world is going to step up and ensure the protection of one of the last functioning hospitals, partially functioning hospitals in the northern part of Gaza. Surely he has managed to reach somebody in a position of power with his appeals, which are completely consistent with protections which are supposedly guaranteed under international law. Surely this man is making perfect sense to people. All he's asking is that a hospital not be bombed and fired on by tanks and not be attacked through the use of robots. In one of the videos that we saw of the Israeli occupation forces attacks on the hospital, you saw the tanks leaving behind explosive robots outside the hospital, and the immediate vicinity of the hospital was completely destroyed. Everything was rubble and like mangled wire and cement. And then you see these enormous tanks rolling down the completely destroyed streets, leaving this like this cube object, which we find out is like some sort of a robotic explosive device.
Did you know that those robotic explosive devices actually have the same personality as most IOF officers?
But as every day came and went, the situation didn't change, and it actually continued to get worse at Kamal Edwan Hospital. The Israeli siege was maintained. Israel continued to refuse the entry of food, water, and essential medicine. Israel continued to fire on the hospital. The Israeli occupation forces, in one of their attacks against the hospital, fired on and killed Dr. Abu Safiya's son, who had been, along with his family and other displaced Palestinians, sheltering in the hospital. And still, Dr. Abu Safiya went to work every single day trying to do what he could to treat the patients that he was responsible for. And he was under immense pressure because on numerous occasions, the Israeli occupation forces called on him to evacuate the hospital of its patients so that it could be destroyed, like they did with Al Shifa Hospital, like they did with so many other hospitals in Gaza. And Dr. Abu Safiya remained steadfast and said that he wasn't going to leave his patients, nor was he going to allow them to be expelled from the hospital without any place to go. And so this pattern played out day after day after day, with his near daily updates being circulated around the world, receiving almost no attention from individuals or organizations with the power to actually change anything. And as a result, we saw a severe escalation of the attacks against the hospital and against Dr. Abu Safiya in late December.
I saw a photo of the destruction of Kamal Edwan Hospital, and it was just horrific. I mean, I don't know that there's any photo of any hospital it's been destroyed where I was like, that looks okay. But this one looked really bad, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the photos speak for themselves. And we have dozens of such photos, dozens of such videos showing the Israeli occupation forces' direct attacks on the hospital. And we also know that on Friday, December 27th, Dr. Abu Safiya and the hospital staff and patients in Kamal Edwan Hospital were forced to leave the hospital by the Israeli occupation forces. And the Israeli occupation forces published a video of the doctor walking towards a tank situated outside of the hospital, entering that tank and telling the soldiers inside the tank that he had evacuated the hospital of all of the patients and staff and that there's nobody left in the hospital. And the video ends shortly thereafter. And it was, of course, published by Israel in order to make it appear as though the doctor and the soldiers had a cordial exchange, one where the soldiers are asking him, "How are you?" making it seem like there's some sort of a positive rapport between the two. But the reality we know is much more sinister than what they showed. And I'd like now to focus a little bit on the details that have emerged since Friday, December 27th, because after that day, Dr. Abu Safiya has disappeared. And reports have confirmed that he was abducted by the Israeli occupation forces shortly after he told those soldiers that the hospital had been evacuated of the patients and the staff. And of course, we saw other images and videos showing individuals, presumably the staff and the patients, stripped down to their underwear, walking across rubbled streets in Gaza in front of Israeli tanks and leaving the hospital's vicinity. And we know that based on eyewitnesses who have reported this to human rights organizations, including the Euromed Human Rights Monitor, that Dr. Abu Safiya was taken by the Israeli occupation forces on December 27th. He was physically assaulted by those soldiers. He was directly targeted with sound bombs while attempting to evacuate the hospital in compliance with the orders given by the Israeli occupation forces. He was then transferred to a field interrogation site in the Al Fahoura area of the Jabalia refugee camp, where he was forced to strip off his clothes and subjected to severe beatings, including being whipped with a thick wire commonly used for street electrical wiring. Soldiers then, quote, deliberately humiliated him in front of other detainees, including fellow medical staff. He was then taken to an undisclosed location before being transferred to the Sidi Tayman military camp, also known as the concentration camp, the torture camp. It goes by many names, but it's one of the key sites where Palestinians are being who are kidnapped by the Israeli occupation forces are being taken to and are being tortured, some tortured to death. Other detainees who were newly released from that torture facility confirmed that Dr. Abu Safiya was taken there. They had heard his name be mentioned there, and they confirmed that he was subject to severe torture, leading to a significant deterioration in his health. And this, we have to remember, is taking place after Dr. Abu Safiya was already many weeks ago injured by shrapnel from an Israeli tank, which was fired onto him while he was working in the hospital. He sustained an injury in his leg. We saw images and videos of him in pain, clutching onto his leg, walking with a cane for several weeks after that. So he's already been injured once in the course of this genocide, at least recently. And now this torture is taking place in the aftermath of that.
Yeah, his name was heard in roll call by other prisoners. So that is a process by where the people in the torture facility with the clipboards will yell out the names of prisoners, people who have been illegally detained and abducted by the occupation. And that's literally the plot of Schindler's List.
Another alarming aspect of this case is that initially Israel denied having him. They said, we don't know anything about him or where he is. And then a day or so later, they retracted that, saying, actually, that declaration that we didn't have him was based on human error. And actually, we do have him. And so the question now, many days later, after he has been abducted and tortured, is why are international organizations, why are states, why are people with power not all rallying for the release of Dr. Abu Safiya, whose story represents one of the key patterns that we're seeing play out in this genocide, which is the intentional targeting of healthcare workers and the criminalization of the practice of medicine. I've looked at what some of the mainstream corporate media has said about this event, and even some of the really bad faith media, like the New York Post. And it's interesting because they try to justify what's happened to Dr. Abu Safiya. The New York Times, for example, said, well, Dr. Husam Abu Safiya has, quote, repeatedly criticized the Israel Defense Forces' actions, including in opinion pieces he wrote for the New York Times.
So what?
Right. So, what does that mean?
Anybody who criticizes us is subject to abduction
and torture.
Is that literally the message?
Yeah, that is the message, right? Like the but also like the notion that critique is criminal, but also the notion that this critique is abnormal. Dr. Abu Safiya buried his son not even 2 months ago. Dr. Abu Safiya endured a shrapnel wound to the leg that tore through his muscle. Dr. Abu Safiya watched his hospital, his place of work, a place of healing, be bombed and targeted on a daily basis, be subject to siege, prevented from even having food and water. What human would experience that and not have a critique of it? This is the racism, this is the dehumanization, the expectation that Palestinians are expected to endure unimaginable physical and mental pain, agony, suffering, and that we are supposed to just accept it without seeking to end it or critique the actor responsible for it, putting that pain on our bodies, using the bombs to dissolve our bones and burn our flesh. We are supposed to just accept it silently, right? And that anything we do, he wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times critiquing the crimes being committed against his hospital, his family, his people, international crimes, mass atrocities. And that was positioned in an article after the sentence explaining that he had been taken as some sort of a justification. That logic operates all the time in mainstream media. And I want people to be aware of that logic, this expectation that Palestinians are expected to endure unimaginable suffering and that their reaction has to be anything but human. That we're not allowed to react as humans would react to deprivation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Humans react by rejecting this, by saying, no, I am supposed to be free. Palestinians can't react that way. Palestinians can't complain about it. Palestinians can't resist it. And not because we're Palestinian, because it's not unique in that sense, because we're colonized, because we're occupied.
Yeah, Dr. Safia is in pretty good company of people who have critiqued the occupation, right? Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Dr. Angela Davis, Malcolm X, right? These are all people who have lodged critiques against the occupation. And if they're going to lock up everybody who's got a critique, like they better start building more jails because people don't like them. And it's not because everybody's all of a sudden anti-schematic.
Did you say anti-schematic?
I did, yeah.
Okay.
It's just because like people don't like genocide and people don't like watching children being melted. And that's like a pretty fair thing to critique, right? Also, like imagine like expecting somebody to withstand a genocide and then like not say anything about it. Meanwhile, it's like I guarantee you if you fucked up a Zionist breakfast, they would have an op-ed ready for you.
There's so much more to be said about this. And the crimes even that Israel has committed against Dr. Abu Safiya are not, of course, not even limited to him, right?
I want to read a tweet from Palestine Pod alum Hiba Jamal. As those in Gaza have rightfully said, the image of Dr. Hussam walking towards the tank should not be a commentary on the resilience of Palestinians. It should represent our utter failure to heed the warnings of this man, a man whose son was murdered because of his commitment to his patients, who was attacked by shrapnel by the same murderous army, a man who was taken prisoner and is currently being tortured in Israeli prisons. Dr. Hussam did everything to not become a story. He wanted us to act so that he would be safe and his patients could be safe and his colleagues could be safe. I am utterly ashamed.
Absolutely. And I think here it's important to give an example of what his pleas to the world look like. On December 22nd, a few days before he was abducted by the Israeli occupation forces, he released this statement. Today marks the 83rd day of the siege on the hospitals of North Gaza. Kamal Edwan Hospital has been sounding the alarm since the beginning of this ordeal to safeguard our humanitarian mission. Since this morning, there has been continuous gunfire in the area surrounding the hospital. Artillery shells are targeting buildings near the hospital, and moments ago, bombs were dropped on the premises by drones and warplanes. Anyone stepping outside the hospital is at risk and becomes a target. The generators have been hit, with one catching fire and being completely destroyed. Now the occupation forces are attempting to target the fuel tank, which is fully stocked and poses a significant fire hazard. If this tank ignites, it could lead to a catastrophe for the staff and everyone inside the hospital. The occupation forces have not hesitated to directly bombard the hospital. Instead, they have concentrated their firepower on the surrounding area, resulting in intense shelling from tanks and aircraft, which continues as we speak. Our hospitals have been denied humanitarian aid, food, medicine, and safety. Direct attacks on the hospitals began with no warnings and no civilian protection permitted by the occupation in the way of normal procedures expected in a combat zone. The Red Cross and other UN bodies were consistently denied access to intervene, resulting in significant harm and loss of civilian life and means of preserving life. At no point were there any military targets or activity in the hospitals. We have been constantly telling and showing the world that we are only providing our humanitarian medical mission to the remaining 75,000 people in North Gaza, many of whom are being mercilessly slaughtered in indiscriminate attacks and left to die in the streets as the occupation slowly dismantles our few remaining medical resources. Despite official COGAT and IDF statements, we have not received any official orders to evacuate our hospitals. We have not been given deconfliction or the required assistance and equipment for safe passage to a place of safety that will preserve civilian life. These are the official protocols and procedures that must be met at a minimum if the occupation wishes to meet its international humanitarian law obligations. We currently have nearly 400 civilians inside the hospital, including babies in the neonatal unit, whose lives depend on oxygen and incubators. We cannot evacuate these patients safely without assistance, equipment, and time. As seen with the European Gaza hospital months ago, evacuation orders were given directly to staff by IDF over the phone with no deconfliction or support nor adequate time to evacuate safely, resulting in patients being shot as they attempted to flee. It was only after calls to media and media attention that COGAT issued a clarification after patients and staff were exposed to risk or killed. We call on the world to witness this pattern once again. We have repeatedly requested assistance and have openly invited the occupation to see for themselves the internal workings of our hospitals so that we may continue to serve our population without fear of attack and death. These calls were rejected. We also call on the world to recognize that if Kamal Edwan Hospital is decommissioned, there will be no way of preserving conditions of life for the remaining 75,000 civilians in North Gaza. We call on the world to witness these crimes of extermination and act now. We send this message under heavy bombardment and direct targeting of the fuel tanks, which, if hit, will cause large explosion and mass casualties amongst the civilians inside. What I hear is a desperate plea by a physician trying to treat his patients in a genocide. Pleas for assistance, references to international humanitarian law obligations, proposals for international observers and Israel to come see the hospital, to see that there's nothing there except people being treated in a genocide. And that wasn't enough to stop what happened to Dr. Abu Safiya. And that leads to the question of what are Palestinians in Gaza supposed to do to preserve their own lives? Where are they supposed to go? What are they supposed to do? What are they supposed to say? Or are we all marked for death by someone else, by our colonizer who has decided for us our fate? If Dr. Abu Safiya, a pediatrician who came out day after day with a sobering message, insisting on the facts, insisting on international humanitarian law, pleading with the international organizations, pleading to the international community, if he couldn't move the powers that be to some action to protect him in this moment and his patients in this moment, what hope is there for anyone else? And I think the thing that we have to take away from this is that we need so much more advocacy and action in this moment, because Dr. Abu Safiya was coming out day after day to describe the conditions of a siege of the northern part of Gaza, which was 80, 90 some days long. And the mainstream corporate media barely covered, if at all, the siege of Kamal Edwan Hospital, the attacks on Kamal Edwan Hospital. It was only after he was abducted that you saw a few articles massively downplaying and mischaracterizing what had taken place and distorting it, right, as we have just discussed. But the notion that a crime like a siege of the northern part of Gaza, the depopulation of the northern part of Gaza, the inaction of the general's plan, Israel's plan to ethnically cleanse the northern part of Gaza so that it can be used for Jewish settlement, while at the same time, the corporate media continues to parrot the line that this is all self-defense. The fact that all of this can happen while it's not actually being reported on in this way is to me an indication that so much more work needs to be done to correct the narrative.
People should recognize that when they are consuming corporate media, that the corporate media is an extension of the CIA. And I don't mean that in like a haha, like I'm a comedian, like that's a joke type of thing. I'm telling you, like literally, it is admitted by the people in journalism. Allow me to pull up the quotes. There's a recent scandal that has exposed the BBC. 13 top BBC journalists have risked their careers to reveal the truth. There is one guy basically who makes all the decisions about stories when it comes to Palestine, and he also has ties to the Mossad. His name is Rafi Berg. Okay, and his LinkedIn shows that he was a news editor for the U.S. State Department State Foreign Broadcast Information Service from 1997 to 1998. And he is quoted in the Jewish Telegraph saying, quote, "One day I was taken to one side and told, you may or may not know that we are a part of the CIA, but don't go telling people." That's a quote from Rafi. And he followed up by saying, "I was absolutely thrilled and was not too much of a surprise because of the application process." Yeah. If you're reading news and you're reading like BBC, CNN, New York Times, and you're still kind of just like believing what they have to say, you're allowing yourself to be manipulated by the CIA. There's actually like CIA is also linked to a number of other corporations, like Starbucks and the CIA have a special relationship whereby Starbucks recruited a CIA agent who helped them in their union busting effort. And there is a secret Starbucks inside CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, where the like CIA agents are not allowed to disclose their names, right? So you get a situation where it's like, I have a oat milk latte for Maduro is a bitch. Okay, thank you so much.
I don't even know what to say to that. I'm sorry.
All of that is true. And also, there's a famous quote by William J. Casey, former CIA director, who said, "We will know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false." So it feels like they are almost there. Also, on that note, the Israeli occupation has released $150 million extra for their informational warfare department known as Hasbara, sort of like our mortal enemies. And so, yeah, that's the group of people who go online to influence opinion through comment section, through Facebook groups, through whatever. They're the people who gave me the nickname Mikey Intifada, right? And they are losing. They're doing a bad job of convincing people that the occupation, that the Zionist entity is legitimate. And so literally our words are costing them money, right? We've cost them $150 million extra that they were not intending to spend. That is an admission on their behalf that their informational warfare department is losing the battle, right? So all of the people who are liking and sharing and doing research and continuing to uplift voices that are critical of genocide and critical of US imperialism, all of that is working. It's working so much that it's costing them $150 million. There are various ways to cost people money, right? Sometimes it's a boycott, sometimes it's divestment, sometimes it's sanctions, right? For you and I, our contribution is costing them money with our words and correcting disinformation so that people understand the truth, because we have the truth on our side. We have the truth on our side. That's what we need to remind everybody all the time when it feels like things are grim. It's like we have the truth on our side. And once most people recognize the truth, once they manage to unlearn a lot of the brainwashing that has been thrust upon them because they grew up in the belly of the beast, right? I'm seeing people out here talking about the dumbest shit I've ever seen in my life. I can't believe people are focused on this shit. But like, once they unlearn that, most people are not into genocide.
No, and I think that most people are already not into it. And I think that the breakdown is between like public opinion and policy, which is not dictated by what the majority believes and wants. We've seen that since the very beginning of this genocide, when polls were indicating consistently that most Americans want a ceasefire, most Americans don't support unlimited, unconditional aid to Israel. But what is the policy? The policy is unconditional, unlimited money and bombs to Israel and no ceasefire, but ceasefire talks as a means of prolonging and buying time for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and the land theft of land from Gaza for use by the Israeli occupation in its plans to steal and settle Palestinian land. So I definitely don't see it as an issue of people don't know enough. I think most people globally are well aware of what's happening, which is reflective of the massive solidarity that we have seen in support of Palestinians globally. Just looking at the demonstrations that have been taking place for over a year. And so that, to me, that sends a clear message. And these demonstrations are not only taking place in the global south, but they're taking place in the global north. And people are coming out in massive numbers to support Palestinians in this moment. But the disconnect is that doesn't actually translate into policy change. Much more pressure is needed on elected officials to force their hand. Biden is going to be out of office. And yet, even though a few weeks ago we all saw him walk out of a bookstore with Rashid Khalidi's 100 Years War on Palestine, he still thought that the best thing he could do in this last month to put this, seal on his presidency as a genocidal one is to propose another $8 billion of aid to Israel, which is to comprise of munitions for fighter planes and tanks to be used to kill more Palestinian families.
How far do you think he got in the book?
I don't even know why he carried it. Like, what was the point of that? Obviously, he didn't read it. And if he did read it, he didn't learn anything from it. Because if he learned anything from it, he wouldn't think that the best thing to do in this moment is to make sure with all of his power that the genocide goes until the very last day, the very last minute he's in office.
Yeah, why do they expect us to believe that he can read books when he can barely read a teleprompter? Like, he is not reading stuff.
That is a good point.
Bro is looking at Denny's menus like it's War and Peace.
Yeah, I can't even say that is a joke because it is accurate. So,
well, it is a joke, but it just happens to be true.
Okay,
So,
my favorite kind of joke, actually.
the lie that Joe Biden is reading that book is stronger than an Israeli ceasefire.
As a result of sustained attacks on the hospitals in the northern part of Gaza, Al Jazeera has reported that all of the hospitals now in northern part of Gaza are closed. This includes Kamal Edwan Hospital, the Indonesian hospital, and Al Auda Hospital, all three of which have been forcefully closed by the Israeli occupation forces. And to me, this is a key event on the timeline of the ethnic cleansing of the northern part of Gaza. Because Israel's goal is to expel and uproot Palestinians from their homes, the destruction of all of the hospitals is a step in ensuring that Palestinian life cannot be sustained in the northern part of Gaza. So it's not enough for them to destroy all the buildings. It's not enough for them to starve Palestinians. They have to make sure that there's not a single place where Palestinians can go to for respite in this moment. We need to keep that in mind, that this pattern has a purpose. The purpose is not only genocidal, but the purpose is Nakba, ethnic cleansing, uprooting of an indigenous population, the theft of their land, and their replacement by settlers. And anytime you hear Israel saying, oh, we're respecting international law, we're respecting international humanitarian law, understand that there are scholars in this moment, legal scholars, who have written about this phenomenon of Israel trying to couch its illegalities in the language of international law by saying that Israel is using the language of international law as a form of humanitarian camouflage for its illegal conduct. So it's not enough just to hear them say in media, which prints Israeli military propaganda as fact with no pushback whatsoever. It's not enough to hear them say, oh, well, of course we respect the law. Of course there were fighters in the hospital, so we had to attack it and shut it down. And of course that's respecting the law. That's not how it works. And Israel has benefited from the fact that it never really receives any pushback in the corporate mainstream media, and used that to its advantage because it just simply says it follows the law, and that's the end of the story, at least when it comes to the media's handling and and also the governments of the global north. Where we see the pushback happening, of course, is in the grassroots, is in the attempts to hold Israel accountable, either using the law or other means of resistance. So I hope and pray for the release of Dr. Abu Safiya. I hope that he'll be reunited with his wife and his kids, and that no other Palestinian healthcare worker will be subject to this type of vicious attack on them as a person, but also on the medical profession. It's really, I think, in this moment, essential for healthcare workers globally to stand up and to support Dr. Abu Safiya and all other healthcare professionals. As members of this profession, it means something that you're members of this profession. It means something that you've dedicated your life to healing. So use your voice if you can, if you're a healthcare worker and you're listening to this, to call for his immediate release and a full investigation into the torture that he was subject to and accountability for the perpetrators is so essential. We can't be overwhelmed by the mountain of illegal conduct and atrocities and have that drive us to hopelessness. Everyone can do something. And I think even if all you do is try to shed awareness about one individual person's plight, it's adding something to the movement of people rejecting this as a new reality. I have been thinking a lot about how it feels like the genocide has become a permanent feature of life lately. What I mean to say is that in the first months of this genocide, there was this urgency and expectation and anticipation and hope that it could end quickly, that we could potentially wake up and then the next day it would be over. Because yes, while Israel has carried out ruthless bombardment of Gaza on a number of occasions before, it ended, right? Sometimes it ended after a week, sometimes it ended after 50 some days, I believe was the longest prior assault on Gaza. And I remember thinking, okay, maybe this will go longer than 50 days, but then maybe it'll end at 60 or 70 days. There was this expectation that there would be an end. And I feel like at some point, maybe when we hit the 1 year mark, there was this sort of abandonment of the hope that this could end the next day. And in so doing, it started to garner less attention. And at the same time, the crimes themselves did not lessen. It's now January 5th, 2025. And in the first couple of days of 2025, Israel's already killed over 250 Palestinians. The eighth baby has just frozen to death in Gaza because most Palestinian families are sleeping outside now, and they have been for almost 15 months now, been outside of their homes and sleeping in the streets for 15 some months. So with all of that is this idea that Israel is hoping that we will become accustomed to genocide as just an ordinary reality, as a legitimate form of governance for a despised, despicable people, which is what they think of us. And I think that's really dangerous. And we have to do everything in our power to insist that this is not normal, that this is not ordinary, that this is the most atrocious conduct, and that the authors of this genocide must be held accountable for it, and that the system that's in place that allowed this genocide to be perpetuated must be dismantled. I know that there's fatigue, but we have to continue to insist on this because Israel is banking on our fatigue by rolling out its atrocities day after day after day, thinking that if it goes just another day, it will force people into accepting this. So that's my take. And I don't know if you felt that too, but that sort of like movement of the genocide to background noise, as opposed to the single most important thing.
I've felt the lack of urgency for quite some time. I remember even during the election when they were trying to reduce genocide to a single issue voter. They were trying to say that, oh, you're just a single issue voter. There are way more important things to consider. And they were reducing the genocide to something that was not as important as like even abortion rights in the United States. And that's crazy. It's crazy to think that you would have to choose between those things. And like, that's the reason. Anyways, that's a part of how they have created it as background noise. There is a campaign by numerous healthcare workers to bring awareness to this case. And shout out to all of the people in healthcare who have been speaking up about this, doing posts on Twitter. We see that. Again, Heba Jamal called out a doctor in Germany who responded to this campaign by saying that the quote IDF should do whatever is necessary to free the hostages. Still talking about the hostages, an insane thing to say.
I don't accept that you come from America to take my land, to expel my people, to kill us in the most atrocious ways. I don't accept it. To deny us food and water and medicine. I don't accept it. You wouldn't accept it either. Why should I accept this? I don't accept the reasoning that being Palestinian, being an Arab, is some sort of a logic for premature death that is decided on by Israel. I always say, like, when I see so many of these stories, I always ask the question, like, why does Israel get to decide when we live and die and how we live? On October 6th, 2023, Israel was deciding what would go in and out of Gaza, what food, what water, what building materials. Building materials were banned. Israel wouldn't allow Gaza to have building materials. We weren't allowed to build on our own land. Israel was deciding whether Palestinians who needed medical care could leave Gaza to go get that medical care. We had to apply for permits from Israel, who would decide whether we could leave Gaza to go anywhere else. Why does Israel get to control those deeply personal decisions that we should be making about our own lives? Like the freedom that any ordinary person has to be able to plan their life, to be able to say, like, I'm going to work here, I'm going to travel here, I'm going to live here, I'm going to spend my time in this way. Palestinians don't have that freedom. Palestinians in Gaza never had that freedom so long as Israel was colonizing Palestinian land, going back 76 years. And it's just something very simple, which is like Palestinians should be deciding Palestinian destiny. Palestinians should be deciding what to do with their time, their resources, their energy, making decisions about their families. I saw a Palestinian mother who had to send her child who was injured during this genocide to be treated outside of Gaza with another sibling because Israel wouldn't allow her to accompany her child. We always try to end on a positive note, but I don't really know where to go from here. So keep going. I think that's all we can say is just keep going. Keep going. Keep advocating, keep raising awareness, keep engaging, keep struggling for freedom and human rights. We can start telling people to join the Patreon. The show wouldn't be possible without a Patreon. You got to get on our Patreon. Support us on Patreon. You can, because like I've been watching all these other podcasts and they just keep plugging Patreon like all the time.
Yeah, I'm gonna clip what you just did right now.
Okay.